Okay, so moving on to our next panel, we'll hear about outputs, circular economy, and creation of value from carbon. We'll hear from speakers from British Gas, from Veolia UK, the High Value Manufacturing Catapult, and Viking CCS. So our panel today is going to be moderated by Andrew Colthurst. Andrew's a principal consultant at Anathesis Group. He's had 14 years experience in sustainability, with the majority in consultancy roles. He's worked for Eunomia Research, and he's led the development of CCS in the power industry for a power plant in Ayrshire. He's worked for RDF and also the European Commission. So we're in very good hands for our session today. I'm going to hand over to Andrew, who's going to lead the panel, and thank you. Over to you.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this session on beyond emissions capture to creating value. We're really fortunate to be joined this morning by a wealth of wide-ranging industry experience. So I'd like to welcome onto the platform Ruth Herbert, who is CEO of the Carbon Capture and Storage Association, the leading European association accelerating the commercial deployment of CCUS through advocacy and collaboration. Ruth has previously held senior positions at the Low Carbon Contracts Company and Department of Energy and Climate Change. Graham Davies is Project Director of Viking CCS, a CO2 transport network located in the Humber region, connecting to the Viking field in the southern North Sea. Viking CCS is led by Harbour Energy. Graham has extensive experience in the upstream oil and gas industry and is a fellow of the Institution of Mechanical Engineers. Dave Dalton is CEO of British Glass, the trade federation of the UK glass sector. In addition, Dave chairs the Energy Intensive Users Group, which represents the most energy-dependent sectors of UK manufacturing, including chemicals, steel, paper, cement, and of course, glass. Tim Durrett is Director of Sustainable Technology at Veolia, a company with over 220,000 employees worldwide, providing solutions within the water, waste, and energy sectors. He is a member of the On-Pack Recycling Label Technical Advisory Committee and a key member of Veolia's Sustainable Packaging Academy. And last but not least, Professor Sam Turner is High Value Manufacturing Catapult's Net Zero Champion and is currently seconded to the Advanced Manufacturing Innovation Centre in Belfast as CEO. Sam has over 20 years' experience in manufacturing, working across aerospace, steel, defence, and automotive sectors. So I'd like to start today perhaps by just reflecting on the text accompanying this session and testing this a little and asking Graham to what extent does he agree that CCS is well understood? And do you think that the UK has the right blend of policy, incentives and investment in place to make it a reality at the scales necessary?
Yeah, thanks, Andrew. So CCS in the UK can play a material and deliverable part of the UK's net zero targets. Industry is ready, enabled, and is an essential path of investment to be able to make the UK's targets, which is 20 to 30 million tonnes per year of injection. The UK business models play a really vital role in incentivising private sector capital into the sector. The UK government, as part of that, also plays a pivotal role as it backstops the key cross-chain risks for the industry's deployment. And that, in turn, will foreseeably lower the cost of capital, making the projects more cost-efficient to deploy. Now, clearly, with the UK government backstopping those risks, it's really important that they have a robust and auditable process for ensuring that the projects are deliverable. And that's the cluster sequencing process that you may have heard about in the previous panel. Now, of course, as industry, we would like to see that move a little faster. And there is an urgent need now, over the summer, to see the progress, as Ian said, on the Track 1 expansion and also on Track 2 to be able to deploy these projects and take near-term and material investment decisions. In terms of the opportunity, and you'll perhaps see this through the Humber Pavilion that we have in the auditorium. You know, the Humber has £15 billion of private sector investment ready to go as these projects in the region move towards final investment decision. The Humber is unique in the UK as the most emissions intensive region and has 20 million tonnes per year of existing industrial and electrical power emissions. It has 80% of the UK's CO2 licence storage and the ability to deploy high-capacity transport infrastructure to link those centres of industry to the sources of storage, and building upon a long legacy of skills in the region to be able to both safeguard and promote new jobs. Not only will it be able to safeguard 1 in 10 jobs in the region, but also can act to catalyse new inward investment. If we take the Phillips 66 Humber oil refinery, as you heard Jenny talk about in the prior session, you know, they're Europe's only source of synthetic graphite, and that's a key critical mineral in the electric vehicle supply chain. That one location in the UK provides enough synthetic graphite as part of that battery supply chain to power 1.3 million electric cars. So as we look at this unique new inward investment low carbon ecosystem in the Humber, we have a real opportunity to leverage both the at-scale carbon transport and storage infrastructure that will be deployed, the both renewable and firm and flexible power that will be available through abated gas, through CCS, in order to promote new fuels of the future, both advanced biofuels and sustainable aviation fuels. When we take that together with the high capacity port infrastructure at the Port of Immingham, we have a great opportunity to both import new low carbon fuels and CO2 from dispersed regions around the UK and in future from Europe, which provides a really compelling vision for the investment opportunities that the net zero future can provide for this premier industrial region.
Thanks, Graham. And Ruth, I just wondered if you might have anything to add to the, sort of that first question around the CCSA member perspectives.
Yes, I think it's only really just becoming coming to the surface in terms of people understanding that carbon capture and storage is actually the only way to decarbonize some of our heavy industries. And these industries are a critical lifeblood for our economy. They're part of our supply chain. They create the products that are in everything that we wear, everything that we use, everything that we build. So if we can't take the carbon dioxide out of those processes, if we can't deal with that carbon dioxide, then there's no future for those industries in a net zero economy. So the solution has to be to capture the carbon and to take that out of the atmosphere and to store that permanently. So I think it's only really starting to surface, I think, amongst political leaders, amongst heavy industries in these communities like the Humber, like South Wales, all around the country, that this is key to their future, this technology. We can't, we cannot do all the things we need to do to grow our economy without decarbonising these industries with carbon capture and storage. So that single kind of penny dropping, as it was described to me by an MP the other day, is really starting to happen. And so I think we're really going to see more and more regions saying, we need this technology, and we need it now. We need it now because other regions around the world are getting it. And if they decarbonise first, then people will just go and buy their products instead because they're going to be low carbon first. And this is a really now race to deploy the technology. The good news is everything that Graham said, which is that UK is really well placed to actually do that. We've got loads of geological storage. We've got the skills offshore. We've got the engineering and infrastructure capability to build this out. And most of our heavy industry is already near the coast, right? And it's already close to these storage sites. So we're in a really good place, but I think it's just about now actually planning for deployment in every region and having a timetable for that and making sure that the business models, the support that Graham's talked about that the government are putting in place is actually available to every region, because at the moment it's quite hard to get that, and there's not really much clarity now, as others were saying in the last panel, about when you can next access that support. So I think that's really sort of where we are on it. And then if we look at kind of what else is happening around that, there's obviously a lot of people looking in our membership about well, what can we get going as industry while we're waiting for this government frameworks to be in place? And there are some commercial opportunities around using CO2 commercially and maybe using those small amounts of demand for CO2 commercially to drive scaling up of novel capture technologies where, you know, you can actually say, well, we can only do a small project because we're scaling it up, but we can kind of combine that with a commercial application and try to accelerate the industry whilst we are also trying to get the bigger projects built with the technology that already exists. So I think there's kind of different tracks going on there. There's also people looking at putting CO2 into aggregates. So we've got members doing that already. CO2 heavy cement. So where can we actually sequester CO2 into the built environment and do that? And I think the previous panel had a question about dispersed sites where they're not close to the coast. The other 50% of industry that isn't in those locations, there I think some of the utilization of CO2 might provide an early opportunity to move and build some CO2 infrastructure by creating sustainable aviation fuels or CO2 heavy aggregates and things like that. But again, all of these things, they need a life cycle benefit assessment. They need frameworks as well in order to actually kind of become commercialized, but there's certainly a lot of that activity going on already. So the industry isn't waiting for government, but I think when it comes to the large emissions from things like lime and cement, absolutely the government needs to support that because these are internationally competitive industries, so internationally competitive markets. So we can't leave our industry exposed to those costs.
Yeah, no, it's interesting what you say about the utilisation space because historically that market is relatively small. I think it's sort of in the sort of 500,000 tonnes per annum territory, and it's really starting to think about, well, where can that go in the future? And I think there's a lot of research and development going into that. And as you say, it's an interesting one, how that's starting to happen alongside the development of the geological storage and the CCS networks. So just moving on, wanted to bring Tim in because the waste sector, which he is involved with, is a really good example of where CCS can play a part. And there's two EFWs that are currently in discussions with government about receiving funding, both in the HyNet cluster. But perhaps I wonder whether this shouldn't distract too much from the efforts that have been underway for several decades within the waste sector to stimulate a sort of circular approach to resources?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm talking on behalf of Veolia. So we are the leading company on environmental solutions when it comes to energy, water, and waste. So in the UK, to give you an idea, we collect the waste of 10 million people in the UK, so public and private sectors, industries, retailers, etc. And waste management is actually the scope 3 of these companies. So we are the scope 3 of the local authorities, of the industry, of the big retailers. And scope 3 can be quite big when you look at your scope 1, 2, and 3. And number 3 doesn't mean it's less important than scope 2 and 1. It's actually exactly the same in terms of accounting for carbon emissions. And we've got more and more companies, industries coming to us, realizing how high is their scope 3. Because they generate waste, they sell products, they manufacture, glass, whatever, and they got offcuts. And the management of this waste is a direct impact on the scope 3. So today I wanted to talk about something like a solution, but a low-hanging fruit solution. When we talk about capture, about carbon capture, we think immediately about atmospheric carbon capture. There's another way to capture carbon, which is at the front end. And that's called recycling. So when you do recycle waste, at home or in the office or in your industry, you will directly reduce the carbon emissions, which is accounted in your scope 3. And that's actually a huge impact. And the good news is it's already existing. The technology is there. So I can talk about glass recycling, about plastic recycling, metal recycling, all of that. When you do recycle, you do a 50 to 80% carbon savings on this waste management. So Veolia, as a company, we do operate 40 plastic recycling plants across the globe. We've got 2 in the UK. We also do glass recycling. and the technology is there. So the question could be, why don't we do more of that? Why don't we recycle 90% of all the material we have on the market? And the real blocker today is not the technology. The technology is there. The real blocker is the viability of these options. So when we try to recycle waste of an industry, the blocker is the viable. It costs more than sending the material to landfill or incineration. And the government is fully aware of that. And there's a new set of regulation which has been launched in 2018. It's called the Resources and Waste Strategy. And that will bring a whole new set of regulations. So we got the extended packaging regulation. We got the plastic tax, sorry. We do have the deposit return scheme. All of that will really give a new framework for our society in the UK to recycle more. If I look at in year 2000s, we were recycling 10% of our waste. We're at 45% today, and the ambition of the government is to go to 65% by 2035. So we've come a long way from 10% recycling. We're at 45, and to go from 45 to 65, a whole new set of regulation will be launched, and that will have a huge impact with existing technology to reduce carbon emission, to capture carbon really, before it goes to a landfill or incineration or being exported. And there's new measures. So just to finish, the key things to unlock more recycling, a reduction of scope 3 for the industry. The number one is like visibility on the regulation. It's been 4 or 5 years now. There's this consultation. There's a debate. Like today is a good example about all this new regulation, but it's not yet in place, and we don't have. I'm sure you're aware, if you work in industry, should I invest now in carbon capture, or should I invest in solar panel, or should I invest into heat pumps? It's very difficult because we don't have full visibility on all this regulation. That's really the main call we are making, is for, to work with the government to provide the visibility to the sector, and then the investment will follow. The second thing is about this plastic tax. That's a very interesting tool which has been launched last year. It's a European first. That's virgin plastic is being taxed in a way in your packaging, and it's very effective, and it could be rolled out, expanded. Today it's only on packaging, but it could be rolled out on automotive, on textile. 60% of our clothes is plastics. So if we can roll this out across other sectors, then we have a great leverage to make these technical solutions viable, as I mentioned. And the last one is on these. On what we call these extended producers' responsibility, which is again related to packaging today, but it could be on materials, it could be on clothes, it could be on automobiles, to make sure that this is providing the right context for the investment. Because at the end of the day, we have to invest. As an industry, we have to invest into the solutions, into the infrastructure, but for that we need to provide the right visibility and the right incentives. Another example. It should cost more to produce a non-recyclable packaging than a recyclable packaging. Today, that's not the case. Today, it's cheaper to make something light, which is not recyclable, with a high carbon footprint than a recyclable, low carbon footprint material. And that needs to change if we really want to give a strong message, a strong incentives to the sector already.
Thanks, Tim. Yeah, and I definitely hear what you say about resources and waste strategy. It came out in 2018, and at the time, everybody was really quite impressed with how progressive that looked. But sadly, we're in 2023 now, and there's still a huge amount of that there isn't a lot of clarity, and there's a lot of frustration in the industry with that. Turning to Dave on the glass side of things, I wonder how do you think the concept of kind of going beyond CCS applies to the glass sector and potentially to other sectors that you work with as part of the energy intensive users group?
I think the idea of beyond CCS is the thing that attracted me to speak here. It's not just about the carbon capture element. We see that very much in the glass industry as one of the transitionary requirements. I think in some of the other industries that I represent through the EIUG, that's much more of an embedded need, and therefore.
David, I don't think I can hear you.
Sorry, I think this is. Is that better? That's better. Sorry. Yeah, I think in glass it's a very moot point in that we've got one or two really big plants that would like to engage in this, but the sort of, not just the policy environment that's been left by various government decisions, but the support infrastructure, the project support that has been mooted but not really made easily available has been a big inhibiting factor. So as much as the will is there to maybe do some of these things, in practice it's sometimes very difficult to put the infrastructure in place to make that happen. Even at a sort of very simple level of exploratory work, one of my big member companies approached government to look for assistance in both their carbon capture and maybe their supply of hydrogen or enough electrical power to convert from gas. There were schemes within government to help that happen, but they needed £2 million of investment just to test the water. And to try and get that out of a group is a very difficult thing. Even though the will's there, sometimes the ability to actually deliver that is not. I think certainly for organisations involved in steel and chemical manufacture, cement is a typical one which is really difficult to decarbonise. So in terms of transition, it's really important that we do have an ability to work with carbon capture and storage. I mean, it's not our job as industrial producers of the material to worry too much about what the use and sort of post-capture and storage is. That said, within the glass sector, I also support a research centre which is heavily focused on looking at helping cap out wells that can be reused, can be used to capture and store carbon. So we're trying to work in innovation, technology development to help in the future of carbon capture and storage, but still very much seen it as a transitionary piece. And all of this is part of that dialogue with government to help them understand the difficulties that industry face. And it's not a single difficulty, it's a whole raft of difficulties. Industry is complex, it has many issues, some immediate term, some very long term. Many of the industries I represent have 20+ year investment cycles. In glass, for instance, if we build a furnace, we expect it to last 20 years. If we need to transition, then we need maybe carbon capture and storage to help us move out of where we are and move to new technologies. Again, finding difficulty in aligning our needs with other sector needs. I think the idea of clusters becomes interesting, but almost a penalty for being outside a cluster zone. There's a lot that needs to evolve in the policy environment to understand the complexities of needs of real industry. I think working with the supply chain is critically important. At the last session there was mention of the likes of Diageo. I had a conversation there 3 or 4 years ago where looking at their own needs and trying to translate those into needs further up the supply chain where bottles are provided for them to put their beverages in is a major part of their carbon emissions in the supply chain. So it's really important that we sort of join the dots here, both along the supply chain and with the legislators, to be conscious of the difficulties of transition, to help us work towards the ultimate target and be very careful. The ultimate target needs not to be iterated towards without revision and clear view and re-looking at the final target. What I would hate to see is that technologies that are now prevalent are lost because we iterate forward and discount them, only to find in the next iteration we could do with those technologies having been cleaned up and refocused. So there's an awful lot in this environment I think that industry grapple with. Collectively, we talk to government about easing that environment so that the plans that we have, and to a man we all have roadmaps towards net zero to decarbonise. I've dragged groups of MDs down to Westminster and we've signed up to accords to help us on that journey. So the will is not lacking within industry, it's just an understanding of the difficulties we face and an easing of the situation in which we operate to help us make that transition.
Thanks. And I wonder, just maybe circling back to Tim's sector and obviously the work Veolia doing, sort of collecting glass both from households and commercial and industrial waste. Is that an area you get involved with? Because obviously that's an area that is quite visible to everybody in this room in terms of what we could be doing more there to create more circularity.
Massively slow. In terms of glass manufacture, the biggest element that we can save carbon emissions from is by recovering post-consumer cullet used glass bottles. Fundamentally, we tried to put that infrastructure together back in the 70s with bottle banks that you saw in car parks, and that got lost to some degree back in the early 2000s when the remit of the newly launched Waste and Resources Action Programme was to get other sectors into a similar place. Then the value element of that almost worked against glass, in that a heavy material with a low value was not the top of the list to be collected. Yep. And therefore, through that, we've found that translation of the value chain to the collector has moved away from glass. So we've had to pick up the initiative there. We've had to do an awful lot to try and stimulate post-consumer collection. But again, government policy has worked against it, in that a lot of glass that we capture now finishes up being shipped overseas. Very simple equation there. If you look at Scotland, we make an awful lot of whiskey, but we bottle it in clear glass and we send it overseas. It goes outside our closed loop. But we import green glass for wine and ready bottled wine and beers, which we have a surplus of, which we can't recover back into our own manufacture. We'd have to ship that overseas and try and recover. And there's sufficient incentive to allow that glass to migrate overseas. So there needs to be policy recognition that closes the loop better in the UK. And we're part of a European infrastructure here that is driven to 90% recovery of the material we place on the market. So massively important to us.
Thank you. And Sam, you've been waiting very patiently. I just wanted to bring you in maybe to hear how the advanced manufacturing sector is supporting CCS, as well as the potential for CO2 utilisation and broader circularity principles within it.
So the manufacturing sector, of course, is both on the supply and the demand side for CCUS. I've been working with Ruth and her members who are essentially manufacturers supplying to manufacturers. And this supply and demand conundrum is something I've heard a number of times already today in various discussions and presentations. This challenge around scale up, because of course CCUS is a central part of the government's industrial decarbonisation strategy. And we've been doing some work looking at the scale of supply required to meet that. If you looked at things like the piping alone, the steel piping alone, that would utilise the whole of the UK steel outputs for US, so putting that in place. So there's a balancing of supply and demand that's required. Paul Monk this morning was talking about an economist study that said the global market for CCUS will be around $3 trillion in the 2030s. It's a huge market potential, huge dependency on CCUS to decarbonise our industry footprint in the UK and globally. And there's a need to scale that manufacturing supply base. So one thing we're looking at is how do we support the CCUS sector, and how do we also maybe bring companies in that supply base and adjacent sectors in to be able to meet those requirements. One thing we're very conscious of is the embodied carbon, scope 3 carbon emissions, as a way of helping to build those supply chains that can produce low carbon systems, but also build the demand and start to break this chicken and egg situation where we need to start building the scale both on demand and supply. So regulatory frameworks, great, examples, lead clusters are part of that, but we need to have a market that rewards low carbon products and materials. And currently, the greenhouse gas protocol scope 3 embodied emissions are really quite opaque. There's a plethora of standards out there, but no standardization of use. So we are looking at how can you get real clarity so you can, for any given product, we can compare one product with another and be really clear on the carbon content. If that can be done through standardization, accounting frameworks, global standards, then that could underpin maybe carbon pricing, but certainly underpin consumer pull and choice, which starts to reward the market for low carbon products. That would actually open up a market for, of course, accelerate the move towards the capital investments required for carbon capture and storage units. And it also actually, if we get the carbon accounting clear, I mean, our evidence should suggest that 40% of the UK's carbon footprint, consumption footprint, that's the carbon associated with goods and services consumed here in the UK rather than produced in the UK, is related to manufacturing. So this transparency and carbon accounting is critical. It will drive the market and help to accelerate and get that supply and demand balanced. But it also, interestingly, would underpin the secondary materials market. So this question around what do we do with the CO2 that we capture and store at scale? Because if we're going to install carbon at the scale we're talking about, there's going to be a huge carbon capture at the scale we require. There's going to be a huge availability of CO2 and carbon-related materials. And if we actually recognise that as a byproduct with zero embodied carbon as a starting point, as a raw material, that is really going to incentivise a market for products that utilise those materials. So it's early days in terms of utilisation of captured CO2. There's a number of activities in the mix at the moment. One thing that's already been referred to is looking at synthetic fuels and looking at sustainable fuels for aviation or other modes of transport is a big opportunity. But also there's projects in place in the chemical sector. There's a project, colleagues at CPI are involved with Flue2Chem, which is working with the chemical sector in capturing carbon and using chemical and biological processing to turn that into the molecules that we can use to turn into the products and services we use in the consumer goods sector. So I'm going to quote Graham Cruikshank, who's sat in the audience here, a great example here of talking about how for millions of years nature has been sequestering carbon through vegetation that then, over millions of years is transformed into hydrocarbons in the earth and we're pulling that out. We could actually look at a way of sequestering CO2 at source, converting that into molecules and materials that we can then reprocess. So, and they will be, if we get the carbon accounting bit right as well, that would be a huge market pull for these low carbon or zero carbon materials that are that are coming in from a circular economy effectively.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Sam. We've heard quite a bit today about the sort of the transitionary nature that CCS can help deliver. I just wonder, it must be probably a question that perhaps Graham and Ruth get asked quite a lot, or they have to think about, and that's the sort of ensuring that we develop all this capital-intensive CCS network, but then we don't sort of lose sight of the circular economy that needs to sort of happen as well, and that we don't sort of lock in, we don't get locked into CCS. And I just maybe wonder, perhaps from the CCS perspective, what your sort of response to that would be.
Yeah, I mean, I think these two things work together, and we've got a number of members who are in bioenergy sector, right? And they are looking at different ways to use biostocks to create products or energy and negative emissions. And that is something that that is something I think that can really kind of lead to more circular economy, more use. We've got members who are deploying their carbon capture technology onto a biomass power plant. So they are essentially capturing that CO2, and then they are going to be mixing that with green hydrogen to create e-methane for shipping. So you've got a sort of a process there which is essentially using that carbon locked in vegetation effectively that would have been released when burning, but then taking that and making that into a fuel. So recycling of the CO2. So I think, as I say, some of these uses are, becoming more commercial and more, there's an opportunity there, and it is a way to reduce overall the carbon subject to strict carbon accounting, as you were saying. But I think the challenge I see, so I think we need to be doing both, but the challenge I see is just the sheer amount of CO2 that we need to take out of the atmosphere in the time that we've got for the climate crisis. So when I'm looking at, direct air capture, I think it's great that we're getting some direct air capture deployed earlier than we would have done probably, because we can use that CO2 from the atmosphere, take it out of the atmosphere, create a fuel with it, and then burn it and release it back to the atmosphere. That's definitely better than digging up those emissions effectively in the fossil fuel and burning them and adding to the CO2 in the atmosphere. So it's definitely better than that. But we also need to be taking a huge amount proactively out of the atmosphere and just burying it away with storage, permanent storage, because of all the historic emissions and because of the amount that we've got to do. So I think we need everything in this journey, and we've certainly got members that are working on both. And I don't think at the moment we know enough to know that it's going to be one solution or the other. I actually think a lot of it depends on place, where you are, the kind of the feedstock you have, the technologies that you have, and the sort of local geology and things as to what is the best solution for that site.
Yeah, so I think just building on what Ruth said there, it's not about locking in on one technology path. It's rather that we're trying to create these really integrated new industrial ecosystems where we need to really think carefully about the foundational infrastructure that we need to enable it. CCS and large-scale transport and storage is one of those pillars, as is green electricity generation, both through renewables and through firm, flexible, abated gas power and or hydrogen in the future. That provides the energy, as we talked about in the previous panel, and the offtakes for the byproducts of that to allow new investment into new fuels, new products, and provide a really exciting opportunity for new industries to locate. And yet part of that will be how can we best use the molecules in the process, be it hydrogen, be it CO2 or other fuel stocks, but it's one core component. And the real key thing is to be able to scale that at speed to take advantage of the huge wave of finance that was sitting waiting to come into the net zero economy. The UK has some premier industrial regions in South Wales and in Humber and other places that can take a lead globally. These are global scale projects to be able to deploy. But time is of the essence. We see Europe and North America catching up rapidly.
Great, thank you. I think I'm supposed to now be reading out some questions from the audience. Is anyone able just to tell me whereabouts I find these on here? In the meantime, I'll just ask, maybe starting with Tim, a quick question about how confident do you feel about the waste sector being able to reach net zero targets, and maybe to what extent you think that CCS will have to play a part in that?
So we have built our net zero strategy 2040 as a group. So again, we are a worldwide group and leading in the UK for the waste management. But we also do water and energy. So that's, for us, it's a key thing to ensure we can decarbonize, but also depollute and reduce the resource impact on the service we provide. So when we look at our net zero strategy, we are rolling out electrical vehicles collection. So if you live in London, you might see some, nice Veolia trucks. They are electricals to collect the bins. We are optimizing the landfill, the gas capture, the methane from the landfills. But when we do all these things, we still left with a big chunk of carbon emissions. And again, coming back to what I was saying, the plastic recycling is the number one thing we have to do as a sector in the waste management. We're only at 40% recycling of plastics today as a country. When you look at glass, I think glass you're around 80, same on metals. So the plastic is really behind, which is actually a good news because we know what we have to do. We know we have a clear path of, if we do recycle plastics, we will reduce our emissions massively for the waste sector. And then once we've done that, then we will look at the carbon capture and sequestration. But we know that the cost benefit today is not ready for us as an industry. It might work for the heavy industry, but for the waste sector, something we are looking at, we will test. But the top priority really is on the recycling and plastics.
Great, thank you. And I'm just going to, interesting question coming through here. How are your companies sharing your decarbonisation stories to inspire the next generation about green careers in your sectors? Maybe we might start with Sam.
So the high value manufacturing catapult, we're working, part of what our mission is helping to decarbonise the industry, but also attracting the talent and representing the broader sector. We're trying to push out examples. Well, the first thing is the message around decarbonising as an industry is a responsibility for the broader sector. I think people like to be in clean energy and wind. That's seen as being really straightforward. That's saving the planet. Industry is seen as being dirty, but actually this is where the challenge lies. If 40% of our UK consumption emissions are in our industrial footprint, we have to focus on decarbonising those. So it's really presenting the mission as a challenge for those who want to come on, who are mission driven, to come and join in, essentially, recognising that decarbonising the areas that are seen as being dirty is actually the way to save the planet. So we're trying to create use cases and put that message out there to attract the next generation talent.
Great, thank you. Yep.
I think it's very interesting in that we work very hard with one of the primary sponsors of this event, Innovate UK, to try and develop a sort of linked up position for energy intensive industries, trying to get research funds to help share technologies. And in putting that together, there was a vast expanse of ideas that were put across all the sectors that were non-competitive or pre-competitive to help build a platform, which we have incidentally now put down on behalf of the glass industry, but open to all of the sectors in St Helens. £55 million of government, local government and industry money focused on creating a platform upon which demonstration of these technologies can happen. But that platform is critically dependent on the goodwill of different sectors collaborating, because the funds are dependent on cross-sector value. And this is really the stimulus to get sectors working together in an open way to share good practice, good technologies, so that we can build a future carbon-free environment. And one of the outputs from that was a demonstration that was mentioned at the previous session. NSERC, one of the biggest container glass producers in the UK, were able just before COP26 to run a project demonstrating on behalf of Diageo and Heineken their ability to use completely post-consumer glass as a raw material feedstock, so no raw materials other than post-consumer glass, and then demonstrate with biofuels, because they happen to be available for 3-4 week stint, to demonstrate that effectively carbon-free glass packaging could be produced, which was a great benefit to the beverage companies to be able to highlight that on their labels and advocate the ability as a step towards the journey that they're on.
And another one here, a little bit more specific. Will the delay in connections to the electricity network hinder or accelerate cluster development and ultimately government ambitions to achieve net zero? Perhaps maybe one for Graham?
Yeah, so I mean, the electric system operator, or ESO, has, you know, a very long list of connection agreements that is working its way through, and there's a process to rationalise them now. You know, what we're looking at is very large projects that have 4 years in consenting and 3 or 4 years in construction. So that's a lot of spend and a lot of activity in the market. And what they're working towards is these connection agreement dates. So if we take one of the partners within the Viking cluster, for example, RWE, you know, how can we get that material investment accelerated into the region for a needed firm, flexible gas power station early enough to make the difference to decarbonise the grid and have no abated gas in the grid by 2035. So there's a lot of really good work underway with ESO, but decluttering and debottlenecking that process of connection agreements and making sure only the parties that have firm, deliverable, maturing plans are on that list is a really key enabler for having a low carbon electricity future.
Yeah. And possibly another one for you, Graham. The Humber wasn't prioritised by the government in the recent government rounds. How can the UK hit its decarbonisation targets by 2030 now?
So I think, as you've seen in the previous panel session, and both across track 1 and track 2, industry's invested very significant development expense into these projects, and they are deliverable with final investment decisions able to be taken in 2024, and for these clusters to be on stream and scaling up from 2027. And that goes back to the heart of the call for urgent clarity on those track processes now and over the summer to enable investment decisions that are ready to go. So absolutely it is top of the government's agenda. We know that there is a process underway, and what's key for that process for us is to maintain the aligned progress between the infrastructure side, the transport and storage, and the most advanced capture projects, so that they work forward in lockstep together to support those combined and coordinated FIDs. And that's why we really welcomed the Skidmore review earlier this year, which advocated for the pragmatic progression of those most advanced clusters to get on and deploy, which we are ready for.
Thank you. The first CCU built in the UK will be a flagship for future projects. Is the government doing enough to prevent competition, reducing the likelihood of success?
So was that a carbon capture and utilisation? Or?
Yes, yeah.
So yeah, there are projects, small-scale projects already happening around the UK. I think the challenge with carbon capture utilisation at the moment is that they are not part of the cluster sequencing programme, which Graham was talking about. And also there isn't the kind of regulatory framework in place to actually kind of, I guess, account for that as permanent abatement of the CO2. So that's comes back to the point that that Sam was making there about low carbon product standards. I think those are going to be really, really crucial, certainly for a lot of the utilization products, in terms of making sure that they can actually then receive either premiums through the marketplace, through being desirable products to end consumers, or also where they do need extra support from the government to make sure that that's accounted for. So I think the problem with CCU is there are small pockets of activity going on, like Tata Chemicals, for example, OCO, others, but there isn't really a government-driven deployment program yet, unlike what we've seen with carbon capture and storage. And like, just to emphasize really what Graham was saying about carbon capture and storage, even there where we have a government program and we have tracks, clusters are being sequenced and projects are being added to clusters, the forward visibility of the availability of that support is really quite poor unless you're currently in a negotiation process at the moment. So it is really difficult for investors at the moment, both in the small scale scaling up of utilization and so forth, but also in the large scale infrastructure, which we know is essential. So this is really, I think, the concern at the moment, given how pressing the targets are. And not to forget that the government's own net zero strategy said we need to capture and store at least 50 million tonnes a year by 2035. It's actually kind of just over 10 years away. And we identified last year about 70 million tonnes of demand from all the industrial regions of the UK. What's in negotiation now with government, what was announced last month, is about 10% of that. So that's, as you said, going to take several years to come to operations.
Yeah.
Really, the scale of the challenge is huge, and I think we just need to be going more quickly now.
And I think we've probably got time for just one more question, and actually follows on from that last one quite nicely, and the point that you've just been making, Ruth. And that's looking at the CCUS momentum in the US. Why not going with similar business models in the UK?
I spoke about the business models earlier, so maybe we can have a first pass at that one. I mean, I think in the US, clearly they don't have a unified emissions trading scheme, and therefore tax credits is a way to market and create a competitive market for how you can incentivize the green investment. And it is one route. Other routes can involve subsidy of capital, and we've seen that in some European states. I think the UK approach enables us to play to our strengths. You know, we can enable significant green finance by standing behind those cross-chain risks, and governments backing to them can really lower that cost of capital, lowering the overall cost of these large projects and making them deployable. And then also bring into play the UK emissions trading scheme, and in future perhaps alignment with other regions such as Europe's trading scheme, to have a similar deployment to offshore wind, where we see those contracts for difference really driving down the cost of supply for offshore wind generated electricity. That similar model is being deployed in the UK business models, which brings together those key strengths of green finance and the emissions trading scheme incentive over time to really stimulate the initial deployment and then sustain through, as Ruth says, a consistent long-term allocation framework for those contracts, how we can really scale up to seize that opportunity that exists.
Great, thank you. And I think that takes us to time, so just like everybody in the audience, maybe just to thank speakers for today's insights. I think it's been a really interesting discussion. Great.
Okay. Thanks very much, Andrew. Thanks to panelists. Our next session is going to be the eagerly anticipated hydrogen debate, so do stay around for that if you're interested. We'll be starting in 5 minutes' time. Okay, thank you.